We start with the second lecture of this semester. Last week we had Melissa Coin, which presented, we talked about preserving the artistic heritage in Venice. Very, very interesting presentation, a very interesting speech, commented by Professor Gianighian. It was definitely enriching, inspiring. Today we have the second VIU lecture by Michael Hart and René Gabri. I don't have to say too many words about Michael Hart. Let me say that 5 years ago he gave, it was 5 years ago, 4 years ago, he gave a speech about Venice as a metropolis. And starting from that speech, we started a very, very rich path. We supported OECD, this very important economic institution based in Paris, in shaping the report about Venice metropolitan area. It all started seriously with a VIU lecture, and we're very proud of that. We hope that today we will launch something similar, a very interesting research path that will bring us in 4 or 5 years in something as ambitious as the OECD report. Today we have a different topic. Yesterday we discovered that the protesters have been the man of the year for a very important American magazine. We will have an overview of what has happened all around the world, but most of all, we will have a presentation about what's happening in the United States, Occupy Wall Street phenomenon in a global perspective, in a global context. For that, we will have the support of René Gabri, an artist which is currently working in UAV. And we will have a discussant I very much appreciate, Francesca Coin, who has been teaching here, a professor who has been teaching here at VIU, who knows very well this institution, who is very much friend of this institution. We very much appreciate her presence here tonight. I don't want to waste any more time. I think Michael and René will have a kind of a double speech, interacting with each other. I leave the floor to both of them.
What we have prepared is, René and I have prepared some topics to treat for about 30 or 40 minutes, I hope, before Francesca's response, and then we can open for a greater dialogue. In fact, even for this topic, René and I thought it would be more appropriate and interesting for us and for you, rather than giving a sort of prepared lecture, to create a kind of dialogue or conversation between us about the issues that we think are important regarding Occupy Wall Street and the Occupy movements. Okay, so let me start with we have two backgrounds prepared, two things to prepare leading up. An external background outside of the U.S. and then an internal, or outside of the current moment, and then one internal. So I'll start with the outside background. I think it's very important to me to locate the Occupy Wall Street movement of this year in what I see as a cycle of struggles going throughout 2011, starting probably with Tunisia already in the end of 2010, continuing in Egypt, then being taken up, in other countries in North Africa and the Middle East, but then certainly in Athens, in Spain, in Israel with Occupy movements, all of this before the Occupy Wall Street and the US, and then I guess one should consider St. Paul's in London and other Occupy movements outside of the US as a kind of reaction after Occupy Wall Street. One of the reasons I think it's so important to locate Occupy Wall Street in this is to emphasize the international character of this this cycle of struggles. And like you might say, at first, I can easily imagine one saying, well, with this kind of skepticism about the linking all of these together, because certainly Tunisia and Egypt the struggles are taking place in a very different political and historical context than the struggles, for instance, in Athens and Madrid, or New York and London. What seems actually worth focusing on, and maybe for that reason all the more interesting because of the difference, is that these struggles, or this, what I'm calling a cycle of struggles here, have taken inspiration and lessons and repeated the activities of one after the other. In other words, like, I think you might say something like, right, I've had people respond to me something like, well, you know, what they were doing in Madrid is so, in a political context, so different from Egypt. How can you put the two relate together? And my response is, well, the people in Madrid thought they were repeating what was happening in Cairo. They thought that they were, in fact, taking up the lessons, the objectives, the methods of Egypt and Tunisia. And for that reason, perhaps all the more interesting. So that's the way I see a cycle of struggles here, is a kind of links in a chain that take the objectives and desires and methods of the previous struggle and translate them to the local conditions. So that's what happens in each of these links throughout the year. So that seems to me one first background and important thing, that I think that the methods and the aspirations, which I guess René and I will talk more about further, one of them being, I would say, an aspiration for democracy, or even a so-called real democracy that's common to this chain. Another is a horizontal or leaderless form of organization that's also common to these different elements, to these different struggles that constitute that chain. That's at least two of the aspects that then we'll talk about how this is accomplished, or how it works itself out. Okay, so that's the one, let's say, geographical background, that this is in a global context. That, like,
well, also confronting the kind of over-concentration of power. You know, I think
right.
that this is a major dynamic that's shared.
And that's taken up in each one.
Yeah. And of
right.
course, it's, you know, when it was happening in Tunisia or Egypt, it wasn't, you know, didn't necessarily translate into Wall Street for people immediately. But you know, those connections are the kind of gray space of our imaginary. You know, how does someone like a Ben Ali or a Mubarak connect to a place like Wall Street? I mean, it seems very far, but I think, you know, because you said direct democracy and a kind of horizontal leaderless
right.
structure, and I think also this seems to me this question of an overdeterminate amount of power. Now, whether it's the same or not, that's, again, like you say, they seem very disparate, but it seems to me that they're all of these movements in a way are confronting that.
Mm-hmm. And in fact, it seems to be a really interesting translation that the movements are able to do, to translate between a situation in which a dictatorial regime is posed as the primary enemy, and another in which a financial structure, which you might also say is a dictatorial regime, is posed in the other, that the movements themselves do a kind of translation of that from one to the other, which is an interesting phenomenon. The other context I wanted to give was some just very brief ideas about the relationship between this, the struggles of this year, these encampments or occupations in the various different places, and the what I called the altered globalization movements from 10 years ago, moving from, at least from Seattle in 1999, at least through Genoa in 2001. These were, and so what were they 10 years ago, in case that's not familiar to you? These were often protest movements that happened at global summits. So the Seattle protests in 1999 were at a meeting of the World Trade Organization. then in Quebec City against free trade of the Americas, and then in Gothenburg, then in Prague, Washington, D.C. against the World Bank and the IMF, the G8 at Genova. And what was characteristic about these, so in Italy they're often called no global movements, sometimes in the press in the United States they were called anti-globalization movements, but what was common to them, and I think it's distinct from what's been happening this year, this is the primary difference I wanted to point to, is that those movements 10 years ago were in some ways fundamentally nomadic. They moved from one summit to the next. Like I said, in that space of 2 years, you know, they would appear each time, and sometimes the same people would appear. Like I said, in Seattle and Quebec was a kind of itinerant, nomadic movement. Whereas the movements of this year are all deeply rooted in the territory, like that. So in Tel Aviv and Athens and Cairo and Tunis, but also in New York and Oakland and St. Paul's, they're not mobile, they're not nomadic. In fact, what they say is we won't move. You know that. So, but it's more than that too. They're deeply rooted in the territory in a way that is engaged with the local social issues in a way more intensely, I'd say, than the globalization movements of 10 years ago. What do I mean by the social issues? Like questions of housing, questions of access of rights to natural resources, of mortgages for houses. Each of these are worked out sometimes in working groups or in assemblies in the movements, but these are the kinds of territorial social issues that coalesce. That I would say, this is now a first approximation to it. That territorial rootedness maybe is two-sided. That I see a great advantage in the intensity of its being able to address local and maybe national social issues. The same thing, I've been concerned about a possibility of weakness, which is a national isolation of the different occupations, and whereas the movements 10 years ago were immediately international in their references, in their trying to understand an international global system, but also in their practices, let's say. There's some ways in which the current occupations and encampments risk being national and not global in that way. So maybe that's why, and I know that this is something that René and I certainly share, that it seems useful to, when talking about what's happening in the U.S., to recognize it in the chain with these other events, that recognize it's not some sort of U.S. invention. I mean, it's a pathology of the U.S. media, maybe of most national media, that to see these things in only national context, so that now when something can happen in another part of the world, the U.S. media could say, oh well, that's the effect of Occupy Wall Street, whereas it was really coming from something much before. Anyway, so those are the two first contexts I wanted to give. And what I wanted to, I can even start out with a question for René about so the question now the question is about the background in New York City, about the gestation and well, I shouldn't go with birth metaphors. The preparations, let's say. If I could think of some good plant metaphor or something. The seeds, there you go, within New York. And I think it might be useful, or I would like to hear, and then maybe to give a more general thing, to first hear about the art space that René is associated with, 16 Beaver, and the way it plays a relationship with these kinds of political discussions, and even the political discussions prior to and during the Occupy Wall Street. Then could you first explain what 16 Beaver is?
Yeah, okay. Well, 16 Beaver is an artist-run space that is located very close to Wall Street, and it's been in existence for 12 years, since 99. I remember one of the first discussions we had then, and there was this kind of amazing moment where everybody came to the conclusion that we had nothing left to really resist other than capitalism and this global nature of it, that it's just everywhere. But because it's everywhere and it's not embodied anywhere, how do you resist something like that? And this was part of early discussions, but of course that was in the midst of Seattle and all of these other things that you're calling the anti-globalization or alter-globalization or no global movement. The space has just been a place that is somehow, I think, part of a whole series of tactics by, people like myself, activists, artists, to try to create kind of autonomous institutions. I know social centers exist here in Italy, but they're not so common in the U.S. And so it's a kind of place where we could try to reorient the work we do directly in relationship to political issues and questions, and also philosophical ones, to put them all kind of together and not separate them. And to do that over a period of long time so that we could also have the opportunity to build friendships, understand what other people are, because the nature of the institutions we have of learning, for example, university, is that you come and you're there for a period of time and it's all wonderful and utopic and you have great discussions, but then it's terminal, it finishes, and then what to do next? You go and get a job. It's not the kind of intellectual, it's disconnected at the end. You have this wonderful moment, it was so wonderful, I read these things, and then now I got to do this, and I don't have time. So it was a kind of a struggle of trying to create some space where you're re-territorializing or keeping track of some time that is communized with others, and you share questions. And I think, let's kind of come back to more of the pertinent discussion we're having here, is that since the crash, prior to the economic crash in 2008, we did a series of seminars with friends. Francesca, you were there with Franco Berardi, Bifo, that came just in 2008 or 9, but prior to that with another friend of ours, Brian Holmes. And we were really trying to ask these questions around trying to understand what happened since 1989, after the fall of the Berlin Wall and the dissolution of the sort of Soviet Union and Eastern Socialist bloc, let's call it. It's a very problematic term. And trying to also teach ourselves basically the whole history of neoliberalism. We invited people like David Harvey and Neil Smith and other people to kind of share their knowledge of this history, because I think it's really important to also understand what's happening right now. It's not new. This sort of retooling, the dismantling that's happening in Europe, for example, all the social welfare or the institutions, the changing of the universities, they're all very much connected to the sort of operative moments of neoliberalism in the 70s, where they use economic crisis to intervene and basically restructure things. So, all of these things are not things you normally associate with artists, like thinking about, but we felt if we're going to be pertinent and relate to the world we're living in, we have to really understand. And sometimes it's really, even philosophical texts are wonderful, but I felt like, am I being subjectivated by learning all these things about neoliberalism? And it's kind of, can be also depressing. But nevertheless, I think that the effort has been to really think through that and understand, in a way, have a picture of what's taking place. And so we had also in this time people saying, well, this thing is going to come crashing really fast, but not in the traditional sort of stereotype of some Marxists who are thinking always the end is coming, any moment this whole thing will crash. People showing us maps of Cleveland housing or Detroit and saying, look, these are all foreclosures, and this thing there's subprime loans. This is in like 2007. This thing is going to come crashing, and we don't know what will happen. So in a way, I think through that process of learning, you're also able to be more present to a moment and not be shocked. And I think, in a way, this summer what happened was there was this call by Adbusters. Probably by now everybody's read this kind of account. And it was in July. Adbusters is a Vancouver-based magazine, kind of subvertising, counterculture magazine, and they put out this call to occupy Wall Street. Of course, earlier in the year in our space, we were organizing a series of readings around truth and politics, trying to address this question of like WikiLeaks and all this phenomena of sort of truth-telling that was emerging from the inside. Inside these very institutions of power, people were disidentifying with those institutions. Inside a military, you have someone like Bradley Manning that says, I don't believe in what the state is doing, and I will revolt from within it. And so he released all this information about the war, and that was a very different story than what the state would tell people. So I think we were trying to examine that, and in the midst of that, Tunisia and Egypt, I remember the 28th of January like it's one of the most important days of my life, and I'm sitting at home and just looking at a stream of what's going on in Cairo. And that was the Friday after the Tuesday and Wednesday the protests had begun, and Friday was this amazing day. And walking out onto the streets of New York and feeling like, why is nobody else on the same page? I mean, why are we not feeling this euphoria? This is an amazing historic moment, and feeling like this was going to end, the Mubarak regime. And I remember when we were having this discussion, we put out in the email that we'll have a gathering at Wall Street in solidarity of what's happening there to sort of reckon with our own dictatorship, So the idea, basically, I'm saying, of occupying Wall Street isn't something completely genial. What was genial is that Adbusters is very kind of popular. They have some distribution, and that was interesting because they just did it like very openly, like put a Facebook page and a bunch of people just say like, to your party at home, and a bunch of people just signed up, and there were like 2,000 people saying that they would occupy. And so we had a discussion in July at the space with we tried to bring people who had experiences of there were some friends of ours that were involved in May 15th movement, for example. We invited friends from Greece. We had New Yorkers Against Budget Cuts, who's a group in New York that had been fighting against the budget cuts and austerity measures that are happening in New York, that of course are related to this financial crisis, but they're also political maneuvers to enslave students further into debt and just basically being more dependent on a system that nobody wants to be dependent on. So there's also was an earlier attempt at occupying the mayor's it's not his estate. The city gives a mayor a palace. He doesn't use it. It was called Bloombergville after Mayor Bloomberg. So there was a mix of people who were associated with some struggles in New York, and then people who had knowledge of Greece and Spain. We talked about our experience in Tunisia because we'd been there for a month. We had invited a friend from Japan to talk about Fukushima, to think about also some of the negative developments of this year. And one of the main points of discussion was, should we take this call from Adbusters seriously? And The event was called For General Assemblies Everywhere. That's what we called the event. And we had done an interview with some people in the General Assembly in Greece, and that was there. So 2 or 3 days after was a General Assembly near there's a bull down near Wall Street, and is a statue. It's very symbolic. Ever since the financial crash, many tourists come to this bull to touch it and take photos in front of it because it somehow symbolizes, I don't know, Wall Street, But particularly somehow after the crash of the stock exchange, more and more tourists have been coming there. It's like a strange pilgrimage to the source of all the, I don't know, power and trouble, in the world. And so there was a General Assembly there, and that kind of began the process of preparing for the occupation, not purely organizing it, because at the end, what happened is it doesn't really have a root. I mean, you can go back to Cairo and Tunisia, and maybe you can say these are really the sparks. You can look at the great General Assemblies in Greece or Spain, and you can say these were truly inspirational and were a part of the discussions, at least among the people who were willing to organize this General Assembly. But overall, I think it's more complex, because at the end you arrive on the day of September 17th, and there's a lot of people, much more than people who partook in the General Assembly, who are there to occupy. So I think that that's a kind of strange prehistory of the occupation.
I thought it might be helpful to give some. I assume that a lot of you don't know the particulars about how the occupations work and how they're organized. So
we're very curious.
One of I think there are at least two things to explain about that, and in some of them, and at least these two are practices that come already from elsewhere. The one is about the General Assemblies, and the second about the working groups. So I think part of the challenge of all of these occupations actually has been to create, you could call them leaderless movements, or you could call them, I think it's better to say that they're movements that avoid centralized decision making. In fact, develop other decision making structures that are democratic and horizontal. And that's what in some ways the assembly structures is made to address. And these were, I know more really about how they were developed in Spain. This, as René was saying, in the so-called 15th of May movement were similar kinds of occupations in Spain, particularly in Madrid and Barcelona and central squares. Mm-hmm. And they too worked on and developed the assembly structure, like I said, for collective decision making, and then a working group structure. The Spaniards call them commissions for, in a way, bringing different, a whole proliferation really of social issues to bear on and to be coordinated within this structure. So I thought that might be, one last thing I want to say about this that we could maybe talk about later if there's time. There's one of the things I've been interested in, even starting with, maybe even especially starting with Tunisia and Egypt, and then in Spain, is a critique of representation, which is in a way already implicit in this notion of a democratic functioning. A critique of representation in the group, but also a critique of representation at a constitutional and governmental level. And going along with that, a demand for what in Spain they call a real democracy. So one of the slogans in Spain that I think at first sounded kind of naive, but they were clearly inspired by Egypt and Tunisia, was one of the main slogans in the May 15th in Spain was Democracia Real Ya, like real democracy now. And this notion of real democracy, I think, sounded kind of naive. Why? Because Well, I think, what do I say, like, any good cynical leftist ought to know today that democracy is a corrupt term, you can't talk about it anymore. I don't know if you know, I mean, that's sort of like and whereas it seemed like a kind of naivete to say, no, we want democracy, we want real democracy, not the false democracy you're giving us. That was certainly true in the explicit in the Spanish experiences in May. And so I think that too gets taken up, or as a kind of background for New York, how to struggle with representative structures, either at the University movement or the whole electoral system, and then also construct democratic mechanisms, sometimes democracy in miniature, how to govern even a square.
Well, I mean, just to give you a sense of it, I mean, August 2nd is what I called this first General Assembly. There had been efforts at other General Assemblies during the time of Bloombergville as well, but this was particularly also became oriented towards this call for the occupation on September 17. And I mean, even there were real tensions about how to organize it, that first meeting. What was interesting is there was this meeting that we had at the space, so a lot of us kind of knew each other, but we were in different kind of camps in a way, because some people, I think, just used the idea of an assembly, but they had this idea that everyone will take the mic and say something, you know, whereas a group of other friends had another idea that, you know, we should actually start discussing practically how we're going to prepare for this occupation. And so initially there was a real fight in the context of that assembly, because was it going to be kind of symbolic, or were we going to like get down to work? And it was really interesting. I mean, that produced some tensions, this very strong disagreement, almost two efforts at an assembly going on. Finally, the second group, let's call them more horizontals, won. Everybody sat on the ground, no microphone. Somebody sat in the center and just looked for a raise of hands and said, okay, you know, what are going to be the issues? Somebody was there from Food Not Bombs and said, hey, I work with Food Not Bombs, and I think if we're going to have an occupation, we have to feed people. So I'm like ready to start a food working group. And, you know, raise of hands who would be interested, just like that, you know. And then there were some other kinds of discussions, statements were made, but at the end, just through the result of that first assembly, there were already some working groups. Somebody who was going to deal with website, somebody who was going to kind of try to, you know, work with the food. Some other group wanted to sort of, you know, the question that Adbusters had said, what would be our one demand, you know? So there were also discussions around the question of whether there should be a demand, no demand. It was a group that was going to meet to talk about that, and were interested in that question. So, for instance, out of that, at least that's what I heard because I wasn't there, I think many of us agreed that there should be no demand, but out of that group came the idea of also doing the 99%, saying, well, maybe we don't have a demand, but we can say we're the 99%. You know? So there were practical working groups that then tried to take care of what would be necessary for September 17th. So it would be, for example, another group would look for space and try to understand, well, if we went to Wall Street, where would it be? If that wasn't the option, what are some other options? Zuccotti Park or Liberty Park was one of those additional options. Another group that was trying to look into like legal issues. What happens if we get arrested? What are our rights? How do we train people to know their rights? So this is what the practicals of working groups result into issues like that.
Just, I think this is one side of the problem which we're very much intrigued by. You know, we don't really understand how these things work. We saw them in Italy. But there is another issue I would like you to cover, is what is the emerging agenda that this social movement is now producing? I mean, is that, we know that this movement did not start with an explicit set of issues. You know, you were mentioning some of them, you know, which are different from what houses, natural resources you were mentioning at the beginning. What is now the emerging agenda? What are the issues that the debate is currently covering, and what do you think, in your opinion, in your experience, what could be the outcome, you know, from a philosophical, political, and even practical point of view? I think that will be enriched by Francesca's point of view, because we do have the Italian point of view at the end of the story.
I often find with the question of agenda and demands that I often find the need to shift the question. Because in some ways, and this is something I had a lot of experience from 10 years ago too, with the alter globalization movement, that especially journalists or even sympathetic politicians always want to know, well, what do you want? And what are and I think both then and now, there are an extremely long series of real demands, but they aren't really what's driving things. In fact, I think real demands, and this is why it's a difficult conversation, the real demands are ones that don't fit within the question. And so for instance, I was one of my favorite slogans from this insurrection in Argentina in 2001 about debt and things was one of their slogans was, "Our dreams won't fit into your ballot boxes." Like the demands, I think, are ones that are unrecognizable in a standard discussion because they can't fit within them. I mean, I think there are also innumerable ones that do fit within them, like a U.S.-centered. I can think of a U.S.-centered list, which would be something like reduce or forgive the mortgages for people who are going to be evicted from houses, or I mean, there are a number of practical things like that. But I think there are much larger ones, like when we were both of us mentioning earlier this question about representation and democracy. That's one that doesn't fit so easily into a like what can we do to make you happy thing. Like if it could be a what can we do to make you happy thing, and the answer was, well, you could dissolve your constitution and create a real democracy in this country. Well, it doesn't quite enter into, it's on a different level of, it's on a different level of response. So, well, that's one thing. And I'm not sure how far that goes, but it's some...
No, I mean, it's...
And the other thing that I think is useful to think about here is that within the U.S. and outside, the Occupy movement has already had an extraordinary effect of changing the terms of political discussion. So even without concrete demands or even real representatives or anything like that, it has shifted the discussion of politicians, of the media, and others, so that it's really transformed the national discussion in the last 6 months. So in some ways you could say that it's, even without posing what it wanted, it won by simply opening a discussion about social inequality, inequalities of wealth, dictatorship of finance. Even without having to say these things, such goal, even without having such goals were achieved. That didn't answer. You're still asking though, Stefano, like what's next? What's the next agenda? And that's something we would still have to get to if we can know about it. But René, what do you think about the question? I mean, we have several questions here. Like one is about demands, agenda, and even goals. I don't know if those are even separable with those three.
No, I mean, I largely agree with you in the sense that, first of all, I think it has to be said that there's a real diversity of people involved, and I think if we truly recognize it as a global phenomenon as well, then we really had to understand that it should take time to arrive at anything more concrete. And yet, the process itself speaks volumes to people, I think, and that's what has largely attracted and motivated, I think, people to organize things for themselves in other cities. So I think that's the other thing, you know, when there's truly something new and it's sort of not recognized because there's no language for it, there's no now I don't mean to say General Assemblies didn't exist or any of these things didn't exist. I mean, they have existed in the past. In the 60s, for example, was very commonly used. I mean, I've read texts these days in Paris, and you know, in the occupations of the universities, there was a lot of General Assemblies organized and things. So you know about them historically, and you know about them in particularly in moments of political upheaval. And in the 60s, I think there are some elements that are really concrete here in the context of this occupation that is a little hard to right now. I think it's not yet perceptible. What is perceptible is this question of wealth inequality and all of that. I think what's not perceptible is the desire to have a kind of control over the basic reproduction of our life, our daily life. That dimension, I think, it's almost like a feminist, horizon, or something that we learn from feminism, you know, that I see is missing in a lot of the way that it's read. Because once you create a space that you can occupy and you can feed people, and they can even sleep there, and they don't have to worry about all these sort of regimes of control, you know, where it's like rent and everything else that you have to, by the end of the day, you know, just to afford to sustain yourself as a human being, you have no energy or time to do something more real, to real work, you know, where the real work begins of thinking about how we live, how we organize ourselves. This dimension is, I think, such a rich dimension of these occupations that is something that is very hard to translate through media. It's something that people experience who are there, and once they experience it, they feel free, and they want more of it. And they taste that feeling of being with others, of not being so socially isolated, and feeling like, wow, there's some electricity here. I mean, the media can show you an image of a small, it's maybe as big as this, Liberty Park, a little bigger, full of people. It doesn't translate. What's electric there is some dimension of this mutual care, all of these other things. And I think that is a demand, in a way, that is very hard to meet. I think it's related to this kind of idea of the common. It's basically that we have lost the ability, like our basic reproduction of our daily existence feeds this machine and yet totally impoverishes us. And we need to change the equation so that basic reproduction is in our hands, and we're not, we have the time to actually do the real work. So functionally speaking, in the time of the occupation in New York, you have like 200 or 300 people who are really, they were feeding almost 2,500 meals a day, the kitchen. I mean, but functionally you had at least 200, 300, 400 up to people who were like able to not do the normal crap that they have to do in the day and just be present to each other, talk about things, go organize actions. It's 4 o'clock, let's go, let's just, down with this whole thing. And this movement, like, just breaking like the routine, the normal thing, it's so liberating, that it's like, you don't want to sit in this situation with this image. I mean, you want to break this whole thing, because this is like, it's in a way, I mean, this is like...
everybody's free to get up and move, don't worry.
I mean...
Well, I think this is a, I mean, we should probably pass the word to Francesca, but I think this is at least for me, when thinking about the next steps and the kind of things to do, which is the experience that has been constructed in miniature and then proliferated in miniature, because it's of course not just Zuccotti Park, but Oakland and almost every other city in the U.S. has some occupation. That experience in miniature finding some ways to have it be, more generalized and transforming life seems to me part of the next agenda that can't be met by. I don't understand how that can't be put on an agenda as a demand to be met, or it's so large that
there's one point for the Italian audience. I think there's one question that I'd like you to answer to. The favor with which this movement has been kind of accepted and discussed all over the world is also linked to the fact that they are occupying Wall Street. There's a very strong sense that this financial world has determined a lack of democracy. We do perceive that something has to change in the way economy is currently run. And I think this is at the heart of the very favorable approach many, average people, reflected upon these events. In Italy we have to listen every day about the so-called spread. Every day we have to figure out whether the markets are accepting the way our government is behaving, and we feel like something wrong is happening in the way our democracy is managed. The thing is, we understand that this is very much frustrating. The question I have for you both is, do you see any kind of exit strategy? Does this movement has ideas about what we can go next? I'm not saying a government, an alternative or a political thing, but a few key ideas about what could be a replacement for this framework that we adopted as a rule, and now we feel very much uncomfortable with.
I think that the question is another. It's not an individual one, but it nevertheless touches on each of us, I think. Is a question about how this financial process has also, I don't know, I'm getting this feedback, is it where I'm sitting? But I think as this financial process has also entered our language, the way we relate to things. It's in our institutions, it's in the codes, it's in the fabric of our life. And the question is really, can we imagine that something will change without also changing the way we live? I don't really think so. I don't really think that it's just a question of having better people run the economy, Of course, things will be better if maybe some socially minded people, Keynesians or whoever, who are arguing that let's just spend more money through the state and blah, blah, blah. But I don't, at the end we still have this ecological problems. We have the same question about growth and whether we need to have an economy based around growth. We have, for me, speaking just for myself, I think it's about trying to find more autonomy and trying to now build up the strength to coordinate between different regions. It's almost like if I see a horizon, it's to evacuate the state of all the power that we give it. But that's just, I'm not speaking for a movement, but I think that the old model of like taking over the state and revolution, it's we've seen how dead-ended it results. I think there's probably a lot of space in the middle, and there's a lot of dirty things in the middle of that process. But if there's a horizon, like really deep, that we are fighting for, I think it's to build up almost like our counter institutions that will allow our decision making to take back more and more of our decision making into our hands. I mean, we need to build up that power, we being individuals, collectives, you know, and because the ones that are of the state right now, particularly in some places more than others, seem to be corrupted. That doesn't mean that you stop working with the state. I mean, there's going to be negotiation, there's going to be, that's what I call the dirty part. But at the end, you need to build up your own kind of counter institutions. I think those general assemblies are just ideas of what that could be. You know, how do you coordinate decision making? How do you kind of really practice a kind of democracy, you know, that would be truly not representative, that people involve themselves. But the problems are tremendous, you know, because again, you get back to rent, you get all of these. So, you know, I've been talking to Michael about it and many people. I think we're all coming up against our own imagination and against our own kind of structural adjustment programs that have basically produced like very constrained possibilities. I mean, how much can we really step out of this norm that we inhabit, you know? Which is like, I really feel, for example, today I want to stop all of this and really take part in this movement. You know, I still have to worry about how I pay rent or this. The only thing that happened for those people that were occupying really is that they didn't have to worry about that for a lot of them. And it was real, and it's still real.
If I was going to answer for myself like René was answering for himself, I would say something similar. But I think when you ask about a movement like Occupy Wall Street, let's see, I would say social movements like that do produce new truths. And they do produce answers, but they do it in a way that's not recognizable and not in the same time frame that you can ask of. So it's especially true so in a different moment, we could have had, in a different historical moment, you could ask, what do the Bolsheviks want? You'd have a couple Bolshevik intellectuals, they'd tell you what they want. It might not actually be what the Bolsheviks wanted, but it'd be what those intellectuals wanted. We don't have that. I mean, there's a constant refusal for that, and I think that that doesn't mean that there isn't an intelligence here. On the contrary, I think that that the kind of intelligence and the kind of answers that emerge cannot respond in that way to you. Like when you say, what are the 2 or 3 ideas?
It's true.
I remember when I got into problems with this. I can't remember where it was. So a journalist in Brazil, it was one of these World Social Forums, and the journalist says to me, like, what are the new ideas at this social forum? Like, things like, you know, I think the journalist wanted to hear, like, I don't know, how you purify water was some new thing. I don't know what it was. And I said, look, it doesn't work that way. There aren't new ideas here. It was headline the next day. Hart says no new ideas at social. And so that's not what I mean. I mean, what I mean is that it is a kind of intelligence, but it doesn't come with those kind of answers. In fact, I think more radical answers, but not. That's a very unsatisfying answer.
If I see some dimension of it that has a kind of response, what I'm trying to say is not forget my horizon thing, but I do see that if there is some really power to this, and if it's truly something new, then I think it will break our old relation to a kind of people and a state. Mm-hmm. And I think that it will disrupt the orders, like institutions of governance that exist. I see that as one potential. There may be others. In the meantime, there will be co-optations, recuperations, etc., people who move from movements into political positions. But if I see what to fight for isn't to call those people names, because they will probably win some good things for the process. What to fight for is still building up those autonomous sort of structures which would then retain their power and still. And for example, it's not abstract. Look at Bolivia and what's happened. You know, you have Evo Morales who gets president, and he's a leader of this country, and they're doing wonderful things. But the minute that he steps out of line, and tries to do something, you have a lot of people last year in December who went out onto the streets against him, saying, bullshit, this neoliberal stuff you're pushing down. We're going to close the streets, burn stuff, and people really made them draw back their proposals, because I think if it's true, this is what I see emerging, and it's coming also from experiences like that. I don't think we're in the abyss. There's been a process. All we're doing is something already existed, and it's just being pushed a little more into the visible. And if we can strengthen those, that's how I see it.
I'm feeling like my answer is on almost 3 levels. One level is all of the reflections that we have developed here in Italy ever since, I guess, September of last year, when the big student movement began and then overlapped with the movement for water for the referendum. And then, however, all of that reflection turns into a different type of reflection with the Euro crisis and the fact of the default, the possibility of a default. And so it's connecting with the idea of what does it mean to be in debt, and how does it relate to us, and what is it that we want. And at the same time, hearing René and Michael talk made me think that when I wrote my little thing for today, I was really thinking about the way I was perceiving what was happening in the US. And so I kind of put the 3 levels together. And okay, I'll go with the outline I had, because if I follow this outline now, we just put too many things on the table. But I guess the first thing I wanted to say is that the very fact that there has been an Occupy movement in Wall Street in and of itself is extraordinary to me. So I wanted to acknowledge the fact itself, because the first thing I remember, at least hearing people about occupying, to me, it brings to my mind the landless in Brazil. So 1985, and Occupy, Resist, Produce, this was the Sem Terra movement in Brazil. And then the default in Argentina, again, which is very important for us in Italy today, because when I met the friends in Argentina, what they used to say is, we've seen that there is a default and then there's life. So in a sense, what René and Michael were saying about the imagination, we hear this talk about the default as something apocalyptical. We think that it's the end of the world. But really, it might just be the end of our imagination within the structures within which it works. And so, in a sense, when I was thinking about the Occupy movement in the US, I was thinking that if I wanted to be provocative, I could say that there hadn't been such a big, spontaneous, and vibrant movement in the US ever since 1492. Definitely that one was not spontaneous and vibrant and all of that, but the proportions are quite extraordinary. Even because of what Michael was saying before, that it's not a nomadic movement. And however, it's not a landless movement, and we're talking not about a need of land, but to me we're talking about a complete different thing, because we're talking about indebted people. And the mechanism of debt, as opposed to the mechanism of poverty, is slightly different, because debt is something that leads you to discipline your life entirely. Because when you are in debt, you enter a self-referential mechanism where you kind of add debits to credits, and you kind of need to find a balance. And the whole mechanism is very self-referential. And so, here in Italy now, there's a lot of talk about the idea of a default, and this definitely ties into a whole economic situation that is extraordinary if we think of it in terms of debt, because debt relates more so to wealth than it does to poverty in a way. as of today, there are 3 cycles of oil production in 3 very big geopolitical areas of the world: Northern America, Europe, Asia. And simultaneously, probably it's never happened before, and at the same time we have the highest level of debt in history. And so when we get to a point like this, what to do? And the idea of Occupy, and the idea also of these dichotomies that happen, that come back over and over, debt and wealth, or growth and decline, monopoly and default, all of these dichotomies kind of seem to interrupt the narrative where we think, because we cannot think the 2 things together. And so the whole Occupy movement, in some level, seems to be a response to a crisis that, or to the structural, if you want, crisis of capitalism, but in a way it's an answer that reverses the categories that Stefano was talking about. When I think of the situation, for example, Italy is in today, I think of an attempt of the economy to become immortal. It becomes immaterial, it tries to become immortal, and within that process, it sucks up life, it squeezes up life. So we nurture it with our work, with our imagination. We nurture this big immaterial thing that's the economy. And at the same time, our lives are squeezed, and they're squeezed within cubicles. They're squeezed, as René was saying, we sort of have applied for ourselves, within ourselves, a structural adjustment program to whatever is around us. And so what to me is mostly interesting of what is happening is definitely the fact that we're talking about an attempt of having an horizontal movement that is leaderless, and so that gives voice to the voiceless. Throughout history, in a way, we have tried to deny, forget all the contradictions towards periods of colonization, episodes of racism that are happening in Italy today. But now it seems like the other is becoming us, and we do not know what to do with it. And so, going to the point, because I don't want to take too much time, but what to me is interesting is 2 things. I remember the IMF, however he was called, but the IMF something, director or something, who said a couple of years ago that we need to get ready, and the authorities need to get ready to think the unthinkable. And to me, there's really nothing unthinkable in what they're thinking of, because usually what they think of is this so-called invisible hand of the market, and to paraphrase Thomas Friedman, the hidden feast of the military and the army. So that's the unthinkable they're thinking of. But what to me is really unthinkable is the fact that we have occupied the common, but throughout the world in a very spontaneous but even simultaneous way. And Michael was saying before, in a process that involves many countries together. And at the same time, this brings the debate forward, because it's not a demand of something, but it's just a demand of life. We cannot define what we demand when there's so much at stake. We cannot define life. We cannot identify life. And in that sense, it's not just a redistribution of resources, but it's another way of dealing with the idea of the common. Whatever that is, whatever it is that we produce together, is something that is hard to be experiences, because we tend to think in terms of property. So there's always a piece of property where I live. But the idea of the common brings about entirely different relationships, and there's a sense of enchantment in the common that is produced when we inhabit the common together. And it's this enchantment that to me is the inspiration. That's the only real solution that we have, the only real liberation that we have in today's society at this phase of history.